Here are some of the earliest statues in ancient Egypt. We're going to look at one in particular, which has always been a standout. You can actually find it in the starting of this video where I show a myriad of blue-eyed Egyptians, and he's the one that's shown on the left-hand side and kind of picked out. But they've kind of figured out his name now, and it's Perenefer. And we'll take a look at him here closely. So around about the 4th, the 5th dynasty, you have this man here, and he's known as Perenefer now, because they figured out the scribes that were mentioned, and through a process of elimination, they've pretty much broken it down to this must be this guy. It's an incredible statuary, and during the earliest dynasties, they seem to have not made that Photoshop version yet of everybody that they kind of put down, and instead made a lot of depictions that looked somewhat real. You'll see them with sagging boobs, our little pooch on the chest, and look a little bit fat, if you will, and things like that. And of course that could have been taken off to mean that they were very well off and well-to-do and well-doing, and used in that way. But after this fact, they, along with all Mid-Eastern cultures and Mediterranean cultures, seem to draw everybody in a better light, in kind of a Photoshop version of themselves, something that did not show any flaws in them. And of course you look at the Greek statuary and they're all so incredible. You see these crystal blue eyes that are on this guy here, and they're a marvel that only seemed to last until about the 8th dynasty. Then there's a couple shown at 12th dynasty, which a lot of people believe someone had a cachet and they'd kept it for all of that time. And in fact, there's another depiction of Nefertiti, the famous one that we all know of. And if you look close at her, she still has her left blue eye there. The right one is gone out of that famous depiction that we all know of. This is a plaster cast statue, and then over this is a plaster put that's somewhat smoothed over, giving somewhat accentuated lines, and then it's been painted with that tanned appearance of red ochre. And you'll see that constantly in Egyptian art, where it's red ochre males and pale females, because the pale females didn't have to go out and toil in the sun and work so hard anymore due to civilization itself, and therefore were kept pale. Although it's a natural thing, you can still see in Caucasians to this day that women are more pale, and especially a woman coming into age, and estrogen and things causes a natural paling too. And I'm certain that when they show the women here so pale, that there were some that did get quite a good tan from time to time, but they don't show them in that effect. In fact, they use the red effect for a time of hardships or warning or things along that line, or to show that they're in action and in battle and things like that. In fact, you can find depictions of the pharaohs where they're not drawn near as dark, and a lot of times just as light as the women are. But these crystal blue eyes are an incredible thing. It's got an inset hole in the white that makes up the back of the eye, and then they've put a dot inside that, and the eyes actually try to follow you around the room. It's incredible every time I see this, especially knowing that most people have a belief that, civilization popped up out of nowhere, and all of a sudden, right at the very first, they had all this sacred geometry and and these capabilities of building pyramids and things, and all the richness that we know of it just poofed up out of nowhere. But it didn't really happen like that. I've got a couple of other vids that are coming soon that'll show you some aspects of that, and that, along with a lot of the other videos I've shown, show the ancients were around a lot longer then, and modern archaeology still has this thing where they try to keep the idea of anything before the first dynasty that we call it here, or dynasty 0, all goes back into mythology and some things, because it leads back to a time of Atlantis, and it leads back to people that ruled at 10,000 BC and for over 10,000 years and all this, and they just can't fathom that that might have any reality to it at all. But I'm of a belief, like a lot of people are nowadays, that this did go back much further. And if they were just guesstimating or even exaggerating a little bit and so on, that this tale shows to be pretty much true. We've seen cave art, really extravagant cave art, shown up all over the north. But there's some that's in Egypt too that I'll do a video about soon and talk about it. And you can see that the same type of people were down there at that time. And believe it or not, it'll go back to nearly 20,000 BC. But this depiction here that's shown of them is one of these marvels that they have. But again, if you'll just start the video over again, you'll get to see a lot of different scribes and people of importance and people of nobility. And every one of the statues that declinate that actually have blue eyes on them. And these crystal blue eyes that to this day they're still in marvel of. And can you imagine if the ancient Greek statues wouldn't have been just marble, but they would have had inset eyes that made them look real? It would have really given you that Medusa stopped your life in a moment and you froze into concrete or marble. And a lot of people had that idea, and I even remember how whenever they showed the old Clash of the Titans versions, whenever the people that were with Perseus saw her, they turned into statues. And of course that comes across as the belief of the ancient Greeks having statues that were so realistic. To this day we still marvel on their abilities to do so. But you can see that same ability well before in these ancient Egyptians, showing something that looks quite realistic. During this time and before, it's looked at as too, they also made a lot of statuaries in wood, especially Ka statues that are supposed to embody their spirits and so on like that. And there's a famous one that I'm thinking of now, but wood things didn't last so long. And you can see the ancient Egyptians used to mark each other out sometimes, and damnatio memoriae and things like that, and usurp other people's things they had already built or built onto it even larger, and then put an epitaph on it to where today we look at it and it looks like, oh, it looks like Ramses built it. Whenever you come to find out that no, this stuff over here and everything predates Ramses and King Tut that came before and everything, and Akhenaten. This temple's been around for a lot longer than this. It is physically impossible for Ramses to have actually built it himself or during his reign. 92 years is a long time for a man to live, but it's well over a couple of hundred years before then. They show artifacts and hieroglyphics that go with these people, and therefore it's shown to be something that was redone perhaps. And that makes sense somewhat, even though when we're doing history we get frustrated over this fact. But when Trump buys out a new hotel and fixes it all up, then he puts his name on it, and it changes name, and it doesn't have the same name as stuff anymore. The lobby looks different, everything has changed a little bit. And so that happened through the times too. But these crystal blue eyes are quite amazing and revealing, because it shows you that in the earliest dynasties, all the nobility, pretty much across the board, had these crystal blue eyes. Again, you can start this video over and you'll see 10 or 12 of them, but I think there's something like 40 something of them that go through. And so this would have been important people, important scribes, and pharaohs, and rulers, and nobility. You wonder where the concept of royal blue comes from. And if you look it up, they'll tell you it came up in the 1300s and 1200s, whenever these people are nobility and using a blue. But we also know the Phoenicians had to do with this purple that has to do with that. And that's a sign of royalty that still goes today through Caucasians. So a lot of these things continue on, although they might get a little different flavor to them. And your soup is not exactly like grandma's soup, but it's real close. And if you take that over time, it can get drifted off a little bit. Let's continue. Take a look at this a little bit more. So this was found in Saqqara, Egypt, and into the temple that some of you might be aware of actually had the procession of the ram head god Sphinx leading into the temple, which is what this was. And that's where this was found. There's another one that's almost as unique as this. And, well, it would just be debatable, although instead his hair is really more like a mullet. And this is Dr. Zahi Hawas's favorite statue, he says, of all of Egypt. And because it follows him around the room and so on, and he was with a group that ended up finding it, from what I hear. So that easily attaches it to where he likes it a whole lot. Irregardless, it was found here in this Saqqara temple to Isis. And so we'll look at that in a little bit too here. But whenever they go back through each one of them and they took a look at these, they've realized that they don't have that many on the list, and they were easily able to identify quite a few of them out the group, like Khufu and the other ones that I've talked about before, and in doing so it narrowed it down quite a bit, and then it left them with a choice of 3 typed people. Only one special thing is that this guy is depicted somewhat real thin-lipped and so on compared to the other people, and even though it's just drawn like cartoons, they're saying, well, out of the 3 that it possibly could be left, it's got to be this guy because he matches him. I'll show you a picture in a moment that gives you a representation that almost gives that same look and appearance as him, if you'll think about it from before and after. You can look here also, he has no prognathism or anything like that, but why would he, whenever Caucasians haven't had it for tens of thousands of years, which is quite telling on the way civilization worked out and how old it might be. For if we look at some of my other videos on Göbekli Tepe in that area there, they've actually changed the dating of civilization coming about from when I was a kid. It was like 3,000, 3,200 BC and barely before Egypt started, to the point that, well, in Egypt, they found a place that they were doing farming at 7,000 BC and can easily discern it. But it goes back all the way to Göbekli Tepe, and now they've tried to make it to where this is what started agriculture somehow. Whenever in a lot of these other places, we actually find that they have bowls for churning and making bread out of wheat and barley and everything, and have even found bread tens of thousands of years older than this. But they don't want to give credit for the fact of that because it'll show too much differential between people. Well, it's already way too much. It's another reason why I feel like the intelligent part of Egypt, where you find out about sacred geometry and all of these things, usually gets overlooked by anybody in Egyptology, and it takes one of these fringe people to end up pointing out that, you know, if you take the bottom base of the pyramid versus its height, that's the exact same as the earth is in width versus its height. And in fact, if you took 2 lines of it, i.e. the front facing and the right facing of it, and stretched that out as one line, that ends up being a declination that we still use today for longitude and latitude, and it hooks up with the Sumerians' idea of 360 degrees for a ball and everything else. And there are Sumerian connections. Whenever I first started doing these, I actually showed you there was just a paragraph where, maybe, but most dismiss it. All of a sudden now, just a mere 6 or 7 years later, they've got a whole, well, 2 years ago or 2.5 years ago, they had a whole paragraph about it now and revealing that it did have something to do with it, but they were unsure of how much. I made another video showing you how much, and it was even in some of the earliest burials that are shown there in the Gibelline area and so on. But now it's got its own page and it's huge. And they know for a fact, because enough people that study Sumer and Egypt got together and go, you know, here's this Gebel rock knife, here's these other things, and you know the Narmer palette, that sauropod thing on the background that looks like weird entangled necked giraffes or something along that line? That's not from Egypt, and really they don't use it after a while. The only things that stay through time is somewhat an anamorphic or animalistic, animal-headed people. It's a lot stronger in Egypt than it is in Sumer and so on, but you can still see it. There's bird-headed gods and so on that are there. But other connections are a winged sun disk. In fact, they've got cuneiform, cylinder seals, all kinds of things. And they were actually at the start of this fighting back the idea that they even had contact. That people were trying to believe, oh, everybody was all separated so bad they didn't know each other existed and so on. Yet you find Ramses has got silk in some of his fabrics, and silk only comes from China. So it came a long way to finally meet him. The romantic thoughts on that are that the Proto-Indo-Europeans all had trade through and all the way down into Egypt pretty much. And so they had brought the king something fantastic for him to have. And in doing so, they utilized it in part of his funerary dressings. Pretty crazy, but there's also a shine of cocaine being in him and tobacco, and those things don't come from Egypt either. And so it shows you quite a lot of connections. If you want to look into each things I just talked about in my videos, I've got the cocaine mummies and so on like that. A lot of information, but let's continue with this guy who is one of the earlier scribes in the dynasties there. They say probably 4th to 5th dynasty or somewhere right in the intermediate between of that. And so Per, in his first part of his name, probably going back to Per-Ibsen, the 2nd dynasty pharaoh that started everything off, that the Greeks took into heart and made him somewhat into a Typhon character, and then of course built on the mythology of Typhon and the ancients that were there before, and the Titans and so on like that. But here we can see some of these scribes, and some of them are done quite better than others. And so people have made the easy comment that the ones that are done better are done by the better people at doing it and less by less. But also these scribes are directly princes, and so children of the pharaohs in some cases, and in some cases the children that didn't before had kids, and they all become scribes. And so this is all from the nobility class that had started off Egypt. And you can look into it. They tried real hard to make sure they kept it in that way and kept it in the family and that type of idea. And in doing so, it shows you a perpetuality of it through the entire dynasties. The appearance of the one on the left that you see there, when you look at him real close, is very telling. All the other ones may be cracked, only paint left on some of them, but just like Greek statues, these were all painted before. I was a kid, I used to do sketches I thought that were real good, but when I tried to paint them in, it turned back into a cartoon. And I think that's done that somewhat too, for there's so much romanticness for the Greek statues that are there as being a stark marble, and how that looks in its beauty versus the fact they might have been painted up, and if not so well, it's more beautiful to leave it like that marble and to imagine what the clothing would have looked like, what color it was, and so on. But they forensically checked them out, and they definitely have paint. and sometimes it's quite extravagant, the painting that's done on them. But that's for another video, I guess. I've already done one or two on that concept. So here are these Egyptians and scribes, and you can see that they also have a name and an epitaph behind them, and so on. And this is known as the seated scribe, but I'm hoping that soon somebody will put his name down there on a plaque below it to realize who this exactly was. The problem with that is we can't find out who his parents were, things like that. It didn't come across of it. Nothing comes across and says, this is Perenefer, son of the king, son of the brother of the king, anything along that line. So we can't really take it from there. Back in antiquity, the common man wasn't known so well, wasn't as well known or elaborate. You look at how he's sitting here in this Buddhist type pose, but you can see he's got these ripples on his stomach and everything, and I don't know if y'all have ever sat down on the couch and leaned forward like that, but most people who don't even look fat whatsoever will get a little bit of a ripple there. But you can tell this guy's got a little bit of meat on him. And well off. So we're going to look at a few depictions of him here, and then I'll go to a page where we can look at some of the other ones just for clarity on who these ancient Egyptians were. For this would have been an appearance like that you would have seen before. And this statue would have been a part of another type of statue. Here's one of those wooden Ka statues I talked about, where you look at it now and you're like, oh, well, that's kind of okay. That's kind of good. Well, it looks like it fell down on his face and hit his nose and just flattened the front tip of his nose that's there. But of course, wood all dries up and cracks and things like that, just like the boats don't quite fit as good as they used to. For those boats that have little gaps into them, and they go, oh, they filled them up with ropes and bitumen and things. No, they were actually, those boards have all shrunken from each other and so on. And in actuality, they made those boats, so another bit of woodworking, so well, they fit together and pretty much didn't leak on their own, and only for parts that were starting to have problems would they really have that bitumen trying to seal it off, which is like a tar, just like you tar your roof and it seals it off. But in these ancient Ka statues, there are a lot of depictions here, but lo and behold, these are the ancient Egyptian scribes here drawn in a picture. And amazingly, that front one right there that's got an extra scribe's pin above his ear looks a whole lot like Perenefer that we've just been looking at somewhat. So this might have been somewhat that he looked like. You can see some of these people are wearing wigs, others are not. There's right above his head, there's a guy with a long straight hair, a hippie kind of look, or a mullet if you will. And the guy that's passing out or collecting right here over him, the lead scribe that's there, still has his hair. But the priest used to shave themselves twice a day to make sure they didn't have any impurities whatsoever whenever they were talking to the gods. That's probably for a different video. So there are a lot of these scribe statues, and you can go to the exhibits and see them and stuff, but why don't we take a look here in a different way at a few pictures that were taken from them and from people going to Egypt and so on. You can see this as simply as I can by typing in blue-eyed Egyptians, and you would think that it would show a bunch of people living in Egypt now that are blue-eyed, and while it does, and you can see one here, they also show you these scribes, like the one here with his blue eyes, and that's known as Maitri. This one here is Perenefer that we've been looking at. And this is encrusted with blue eyes and painted in right here, but they also show you that, hey, kids there still show up with blue eyes, but it's a lot more rare than it used to be. The demographic has actually changed. In fact, I did a recent video using Robert Sepper's work on cargo cults and their beliefs And in doing so, we ended up showing you where these papers were written that actually said that they're much more closer to the modern Europeans and ancient Anatolians, not necessarily the Turkish people that live there now, than they are currently in Egypt. And there's only about a 1% match, mainly in the Coptics that are there, that have the exact same thing about them. And the odd thing for Afrocentrics is there's even papers written straight out that said that the reason that they're different and what's different about their genetics and got changed was that they now have some admix from having been involved in the slave trade that didn't actually come into effect all the way up until after Roman times. And that was the differential that was there. There's a lot of these statues, and they'll show them over and over again sometimes. And here's a good depiction of a few of them here with Maitreya in the bottom. And then in the top right, there's our seated scribe that's there. And you can see he's just drawn as a tan type person. That's copper, and he looks kind of like my dad as a youngster. I don't dare say a youngster. Whenever I was a kid, when Dad was still 35 or whatever, looked a lot like that. But also, here in the middle, two that are on the bottom there, this is two of the nobility of about the same time. They're using those same crystal blue eyes. And this is a husband and wife that are there. You can see how pale she's drawn, and then he's drawn with somewhat of a tan. And I'm willing to believe that people that are living in Egypt get a tan. Here's one of those wooden Ka statues that, even though it's wood, has that effect of the blue eyes that are on there. All the rest of these statues are made of plaster and full built out of stone, but the Ka statue of copper here is also made of wood, and you can tell it because of the way it's cracking up and everything that's there. So there are a lot of these guys that you could go back through, and again, I think the number's up in the 40s of statuaries that they have of people that have this blue-eyed inset look like this, showing you who they are. No matter what, you have that, and then you have the phenotype. But does that still exist in Egypt today? Well, we've already seen one or two that do with that kid there. Here's another one that's here. There's a famous girl that sells cards out in front of there too that has pretty eyes that everybody always talks about. Here's Nefertiti, and you can see the color of her skin, her phenotype, but she also has one blue eye. There she is, Nefertiti. I guess it's not showing all of the picture and frame that I have here. But how long was this around? Did they just show up right there and that's what made the dynasties? No. Here's blue-eyed statues from Naqada II period. So this is pre-dynastic Egypt, showing you that they had blue eyes. And this is before the pharaohs. Pharaoh just means big house too, by the way, and they didn't really use that as a nomenclature for the Greek kings for a long time during this. So here's another picture of her with her blue eyes that we just saw in the other picture that's there. That's Nofret. Her husband's Rahotep. You can look this up. You can also tell that she's wearing a wig over other hair that's already there. It shows it to be dark somewhat, but it's not braided fine like it is on the wig. Wigs are also pretty interesting too. If you'll just look up, if you'll wiki hair, just hair itself, and go down to the middle, you'll find them mention curly, and the example they use is blonde-haired person, including his scalp, that was found up under a dark wig. So that might make a little more sense. Another effect here is that you can see that a lot of these people have blonde and red hair. And we of course know that blue eyes are associated with that. A lot of blue-eyed people have darker hair there too, like my brother. So amazingly, I'm a dirty blonde, if you will, and had quite blonde hair whenever I was young. So did my sister. My brother has darker hair. Well, my dad had darker hair. My mom used to be somewhat of a blonde whenever she was younger. It was lighter, and then it turned brown or golden brassy when she got older. But even Ginger here, this pre-dynastic Ghibelline mummy, has the blonde hair. And of course, people have said things like, well, whenever they do the natron process, this, that, and the other. Well, A, it's all Caucasian hair. And B, they tested it with natron, all kinds of different people's hair, and they couldn't get it to change a single bit because it doesn't have that effect. But what it does do to these bodies is dries them all up. And when you take something that's pink like meat, turn it into beef jerky, it turns quite mahogany colored. And then they turned around and painted these people up with a mixture of bitumen and tar, and the tar actually comes from somewhere up in the northern European type of area. And there are people that are found, I saw one a minute ago, like this guy here. Whereas if you looked at him, you would say, oh, that's a tourist that somebody took a picture of. No, he speaks Egyptian and Coptic, and he is an Egyptian that's from there. Why do some Egyptians have blue eyes? Here's the question that's written onto it. And of course, a lot of things are made and lies by Afrocentrics trying to include themselves in something that they didn't know existed. But it can also be found in the Sumerians and where that comes from. And so now we have a connection from just the nobility of there. But then again, some of these are pictures of the gods of Sumer, and then some priests of Sumer that are well known. So their gods had blue eyes. It's kind of weird. In a modern day, we're doing a whole lot of pandering. I don't know when they'll possibly get tired of seeing things like this, which makes them just more jealous and lying as they see that and go through it. But this is the way Isis looked before the first dynasties. Well, this is done much more, but this is from a Pinterest group where it says ancient Egyptians depicted with blue eyes and Caucasian skin tones. I don't know if they'll go into it, but there's a famous book that says red ochre males and pale women. And what does it talk about? Well, it talks about the fact that everybody in the Middle East and around the Mediterranean used to use this same art depiction of a tanned male and a pale female, utilizing red ochre and yellow ochre in the matter to do so, because there was only about 6 colors available at the time people have made and created. Clearly depicting who these people look like. Don't know if you can really tell it there, but Isis's eyes are blue, and so is the little shade line that's above it. But that's just like the picture that's shown here, where they've got an eyeshadow that's above it, that they used to make it out of emeralds or in the Egyptian blue and so on like that. So it's pretty interesting there, especially noting the demographic that's there now. And you'll see Afrocentrics try this so hard is to turn around and show something like this and try to equate it. But the Dogon did not know the Nubians existed, and they're not related. Just Afrocentrics go off skin tone, and anybody darker than a sheet of paper, they start claiming we, when they actually didn't know it existed. So, but Nubians are shown here, but hey, in Ramses' tomb and the tomb of Hoy, it shows them with blonde and red hair. How does that work out? Well, actually, the Dinka tribe that's up there in the Horn type of area, to this day, take piss baths, and the urine causes their hair to bleach out in a weird way and turn red. But what's really being shown there is they're being venerative towards Ramses and the Egyptians wearing blonde and red hair. And if you look at the guys that are pulling the chariots in that too, they have blonde hair. It's not something that's like, oh, there is a blonde. It's that most, if not all, nobility show this effect, and they carry this effect. See, the way red hair works in a redhead is you have to have it, the genes in you, although you may not be a redhead, but you probably got one in your family. and then somebody else would have to too, leaving forth a redhead. So it shows you a connection that's there that most people in a modern day don't want to agree with. Here's an early Nakata pre-dynastic sculpture of a lady with blue eyes. Here's Rahotep and Nofret again, and this is in the 4th dynasty and during the Pyramid builders and so on, and I think you can easily tell who and what these people are. So it makes you wonder how Afrocentrics feel like they've got anything to go on, and they really don't. They're just spinning a bunch of lies. But that's probably for other videos. What's this? Oh my gosh, he's blonde. And this guy's got a red beard. Oh wait, maybe those are foreigners. Or maybe they're Egyptians. It could both be possible. Isn't that amazing? There's E7's picture, but if you look, and I guess E7, when you see this, you may want to look this up. Charles Firth, Punk Planning, Egypt, charlesfirthblogspot.com. He's using your picture. So he's probably seen your work. There are black people with blue eyes, but whenever they have it, it's actually, what's the statement? It's 11 times, or is it 16 times less probable to even happen than being an albino. And a lot of that would be from their E1, B1 genetics that are given to them by the Berbers, people thought. But as they've looked into them, these modern ones they find with it, they don't have that effect. What they've got is they've got a genetic mutation that's messing with their eye, and it's causing their eye to turn blue. About 1 out of 16 of them that have this effect, it's 11 and 16, yeah. 1 out of 16 of them that has this effect will have the blue, as opposed to, instead of being a brown eye, it'll be a real light or golden eye. The same thing happens to Caucasians. Here's a blue-eyed Egyptian, who I'm guessing is a model for sure, but you can see his eyes are just white frosty. They're just a little bit blue. They're almost so white because he's got that genetic same problem that's there. That's not normal for blue eyes, right? So anyhow, to look upon this, you would say that most of the Egyptian scribes, of course, are well shaved and everything, but they look like this. And in a modern day, there are people living in Egypt and they don't look like that. In fact, the ones that we can find that still show a remnant or trace of the ancient genetics that were there, and then what would pop up naturally, usually look like this. And you can see his blue eyes, but you can also tell he's quite mixed. And that wasn't the effect back in the day. And we've done these genetic studies that I tell you about, and in doing so, they ended up showing who they were. And that's the reason the paper ended up being titled something like, these people are more related to the Europeans and ancient Anatolians than the current Egyptians. I know I ruffle a lot of feathers when I say that, because everybody else is trying to say that the Egyptians that are there now are the same that were there before. No, they're different. This easily shows it. Then also you look at the genetics and you go, no, that shows it too. And what do they point out? Well, any black person that showed up in their portion into their admix took them off the scale as far as being closely related to the ancient Egyptians. 16% or so of being a partial Negroid from slave trade made it to where they only have a 1% connection there, and it's the rest of their genetics that do it, not black. Ironically, showing you straight out that blacks didn't have anything to do with Egypt, not in their genetics whatsoever, and in fact, when they do show up, it changes it to where the people no longer have a connection. Isn't that odd? Let's see if I can find this other place. Here's a showing of ancient scribes and some of the beautiful artwork of the earliest times that are being shown there. And whenever they mention that, they utilize that man right there for the effect to tell you about it. Now, I'll get pinned real quick on this if I let it go for more than 5 or 6 seconds at a time, so I'm going to have to cut in here back and forth while it says this, but listen in this show what they say.
To all Egyptian art. Engraved on a stele found in Abydos, one of these men appears seated next to his wife, and for anyone who knows how to read the hieroglyphs engraved on the stone, he himself describes his qualifications.
So, I don't think that he was the one that actually made his own funeral stele. Someone else probably did afterwards, but in remembrance of him and out of respect for him, wow, where are those lines on there? Anyhow, out of respect for him, they'll end up showing you that. Now, he's going to end up telling you that he knows how to make the insoluble paints and everything that are amazing that they made, and that it's passed on to father from son. Father to son.
I know how to estimate dimensions, recut, and fit until an element is in place. I know the posture of the male statue and the appearance of the female, the attitude of the 11 birds of prey.
So he's able to draw all kinds of things. Now, in their hieroglyphs, they've got different birds like the ibises and hawks and things like that. But also he's telling you that he was an artist, that he knows how to show them in form, in movement, showing not just here's a bird, but actually looking real, like we looked at a minute ago with the ducks flying and so on.
The arm movements of a hippopotamus hunter and the leg movements of a running man. I know how to make pigments and products that melt without fire burning them, and that moreover are insoluble in water.
That's probably real important to all of this. For if these people wouldn't have had this type of advanced paint, we wouldn't have much, if anything, to look at nowadays in a modern day. And we're so lucky that they actually mummified themselves, because it kept them in a way to where in a modern day where people are trying to lie about it or be deceitful or perhaps being a little ambiguous and just unsure or we can end up finding that, yeah, there's a whole lot of these blue-eyed, blonde, and red-haired Egyptians in here. And so, not that they all were, but in that effect, it shows you which Caucasians we're talking about, who had this certain hair. I remember years ago when this got hit by somebody and they turned around and said, oh, this is just Caucasians from down here. They're not related whatsoever. Don't have anything to do with them, Well, genetics finally stepped up to the plate shortly after that and said, nope, you're not right. King Tut is R1b, and the most people in the world in the R1b now are Caucasians, of course, and that live in Western Europe. Oh my gosh. That had to be devastating. But at the same time, you can tell that what they're doing now is just trying to ignore it and busy, desperately trying to tell somebody that they knew Egypt existed, which is not true in any way, shape, or form. The only ones that did are the Nubian Nilotics, and they're not even related to them. And the Nilotics weren't allowed to come into Egypt for a large period of time, almost like an apartheid situation, and there were border steles and so on. They built a giant castle at Buhin and these other places, so they couldn't pass. You shall not pass. There was also the Medjay were sent to turn around and keep them away, and if you caught one, they don't want him as a slave. You cut off his right hand and bring it, and that's good enough, and don't even bring him here. They didn't want him, and they actually gave more for a dead one that they had conquered and killed in his hand than they would for a live one. Isn't that quite telling?
Nobody will know of this except me and my eldest son, the god having ordered that he become an initiate.
So again, now we're talking about the fact that somebody's eldest son would be selected for being a scribe, and also kings that had other things to go, the princes. The kings knew how to scribe and things like that. They all went through school like this type too. So they all would have known it. But of course, if you don't ever get to become a king, quite often there are scribes or other people that are priests and so on. But those are literate people too, because they've got a lot of notes being passed back and forth between those people. And it shows you that they have that going on. And they weren't bringing in a scribe come up and read it to you, although that could have happened. But they were also both literate there. But also all that leading hierarchy class would have been Caucasians with this effect that's on them. And the way that the pharaohs bred so much and did so much and they were so revered, you can see how that would easily cascade down through society. So it makes you wonder why there's not more blonde people that are there in Egypt now. What happened? Well, there was conquest from quite a few people. A lot of people look at those as, oh yeah, the Greeks and everybody, those are the guys that are blondes and redheads and so on. So that's where they get it from. And it's like, are you going to say they invaded before it ever started? And were there the whole time then? Is that what you want to go with? Because here they are from pre-dynastic all the way through. And in Sumer and other places also. So it's a well-known fact. And because of crap in World War II, everybody's taken this idea of Aryans and what they thought of them and turned it around and tried to make it a bad thing. And all kinds of lies are being told, or people all of a sudden went stupid and ambiguous whenever years ago they knew this. But most people that are listening now don't ever get taught anything like this whatsoever. No. Then, in fact, more often than not, they tell you the people that are there now, the people that were there then. Well, what's the difference? Oh, yeah, they only have a 1% match now because they've got admix. So these are scribes of ancient Egypt. And there's this whole video that I'm looking at here that's 52 minutes long that talks about all these different things have to do with scribes. I looked up scribes of ancient Egypt and it shows, it's on this Odyssey channel, who made ancient Egypt's most iconic masterpieces. Well, it was scribes of ancient Egypt, but they were also derived from nobility, and of course they tried to hang that together, so there's a strong connection all the way through perpetually. And again, West Sub-Saharans didn't even know Egypt existed. I'll show you that again in other videos. Peace.